Hello, my name is Femi Oresanya. I'm an architect. And my connection with this fantastic building, the Northcote Road Library, is that I came here as a young child when we first moved into the area back in 1974. And I spent most of my early days in this place doing homework, borrowing books, doing reading competitions. And when I turned 16 after my GCSEs, or we called them O-levels back then, I got a Saturday job here and continued being a Saturday assistant working through the holidays until I went away to university to read architecture. So I'm an architect now, and I lead a lot of our public sector projects for HOK, a practice that I've been with for the last 24 years. And it's just great to see this building again. I've written a few articles for architectural journals, and about 2 years ago, I was asked by the editor to think of a building that had been instrumental in me becoming an architect. And there were a number I could have chosen, but I chose Northcote Library primarily because I used to come here and do a lot of my homework and a lot of research. And actually, when I started studying architecture, it was a great resource for me because we had a fairly extensive collection of books on architecture. And so I decided to write about this building. And what's kind of quite interesting, I didn't actually appreciate the architecture until I started studying architecture. And it was, you look at the panelized system, quite, some people may call it a brutalist piece of architecture, but quite efficient in the way in which it was designed. Prefabrication, you could almost imagine that these were made off-site and brought on as a cladding feature. Yes, it looked incongruous with the area, but it was a local library made with a material that, I suppose, evokes a level of permanence. Quite modernist, 1960s design. And actually, this is granite. Most people think it isn't. But obviously, as you can see, it's a fairly defined opening with some grills. The way that those windows chamfer out, almost in a way to try and pull light in. That would be the upper, what would be the ground floor, and that probably almost definitely would have been light pushing down to the reference or to the lower ground section. Quite ordered. I like it. So there was this idea of trying to create some level of civic architecture, probably not with a very large budget, but it's quite easy to read. You can see where the entrance is. Yes, with the big arch and then the smaller order. So you can see it's quite of its time, designed in the mid-60s, opened in 69, and the entrance is quite formal with the small overhanging canopy there. Those doors, I know they're on automatic sliders, but they used to be just you push and pull. You'd come in through that. And then when you'd come in, just looking at this plaque and, trying to find out who the architect was in public documents, you can't, but it's listed, it's written down here, L. Phillips Erebus. So he was obviously a fairly senior architect as part of and he was part of the RIBA, which is the Royal Institute of British Architects, with Corbett as the borough librarian at the time, built by Robert Hart and Sons. You'd come in on the right-hand side, and that was only one way. So that opened this way, and that door opened the other way. Interesting, as I'm looking, it's got exit and exit. I could never remember them both being open and closed. And you'd drop the books off that you'd borrowed, they'd get checked in, and then you'd go either up to the junior library if you were a junior, or you'd go through to the adult section. And interestingly, that barrier is no longer there. That's been taken down since there used to be another door that allowed you to go in to the adult section, and then once you'd chosen your books, you'd come back down, and that's where you'd borrow it. I remember you could borrow up to 6 books, and all your membership details were kept in this area here. And the junior section, where you had books, those books were at children height, but the main bookshelves were the same, designed to be at the same height as the adult ones. Obviously, I'm a bit taller now, but it's funny how these seem so tall back then. No, and that's probably my abiding memory. By the time I obviously moved up to to the adult section. I'd grown tall enough, but I remember as a young kid, as a young boy, looking for books at the top shelf, and my sisters, when I used to come in with my two sisters, and they'd look for a book, and sometimes they even had. Do you remember those little stools with the wheels that you sit on when you're stricting? Well, that's how we got to the top. That's how we got to the top shelf back then. That fire exit. As a junior, you couldn't walk from here to here. You had to go out around. Oh, so there used to be a no entry because that was the adult section. It could have been for, I don't know, I can't remember well, but we wouldn't have been able to do what we've just done. The junior section has pretty much stayed the same. I was extremely pleased as I was walking up and I could see the Gadget Teens poster and the reading competition, the reading challenge, which ran through the summer holidays. And my mother basically said to myself and my two sisters that was our homework for the holiday. And it was 10 books that you needed to have read and answered questions on. I don't know if it's still the same now. It got marked and the top 3 won prizes. Everyone got a certificate if you completed it. I think I won the odd prize or 2, I can't remember, but I've still got those certificates now, and it's for someone who really enjoyed reading at the time, it was easy for me, but I can understand that those who probably weren't, if there was a challenge. And I think as I got older, we used to have little reading sections and reading hours, and would just take a book and read to some of the youngsters that came in as well. So it was a real community kind of, even though it was a library, it felt like a bit of a community thing. And for me, I suppose it could have been like a mini creche, really. My school, I went to Honeywell School, which is just the next block along. And as a young person, I'd finish school, go home, because we lived on Broomwood Road, had a bite to eat, and came down to the library. And I'd do my homework here. And pretty much most days of the week, if I wasn't doing after school activities, I'd come into the library. It was just natural, and if I was looking for something, I would ask the librarian. If it was a reference thing, as I got older, all the reference section was downstairs. The Encyclopedia Britannica was down below. The font of all knowledge. And it's interesting, obviously it's getting ready for Christmas. I can't remember what Christmas that could have been, although you can date it because there's a poster there that says 100 years. So, I don't know, for those of you who can remember 100 years when Alice in Wonderland was written, you could probably try and date that photo. And then a Christmas party. It'd be interesting to see who were there and what year that was taken. It's great being back here, but as I stand here and I look down now, this isn't the layout that I remember. It's changed a little bit. First of all, there is a lift that probably came in the 90s, probably to address the issues of accessibility again. And down here, we used to have the books for those who, the slightly older readers, so the larger print books, and for those who couldn't come up the stairs. There used to be an exhibition space just below here for when, there was an event or they managed to get in some really sensitive books, and they'd be there. It's interesting, the mezzanine where you'd come for the newspapers and magazines, and then you'd come upstairs to the main adult library. Obviously, the junior library is just below, or just off the mezzanine level. And obviously, more recent editions of DVDs and CDs. As I'm looking down there, we didn't have those back then, but we used to have records. Records, 12 inches, albums, 7 inches, and you could borrow them and listen to them. And I do remember borrowing some, recording, and then bringing them back, putting them onto tape. You needed to get up quite quickly before someone else got them and maybe scratched them up a little bit. But when I started working here as a Saturday assistant, if you knew what was coming in, you could make sure you got first dibs on them before it actually went on to onto the general library bit. So you could actually, you had a collection of TDK 90 tapes that you'd record your music on. Because we were broke back then, I remember being paid £4 an hour for a 4-hour shift on a Saturday, it's good memories. It's amazing how the space still, this double height space still really gives a sense of civicness. And the way in which you could see people moving all the way through the day, and the views were great because over there was, if you were working on either cataloguing books or whatever, you could also look across the whole library. There were good vantage points, and what's quite interesting for me now, having worked on a few library projects, it's all about being able to, for the librarian, to be able to see pretty much every crevice. And I think this library kind of works in that respect, even though it is multi-layered, but you still have good vantage points. And then you came up here, where see, the computers are new, but there used to be. It went from bookshelves to seating, maybe back to seating again. We used to keep some bookstores there. There used to be a book lift, which is still there. It was great to see. But then you had the head librarian's office round the back, where you'd sometimes go for a little quiet chat. And then, the library would start from there using the Dewey Decimal System. And you'd have the hundreds there, and then it would work your way around to the 200s section, 300 sections, 4s and 5s, 700s, 800s, 900s, and then you had the really special reference books behind the librarian, which you needed to give your library ticket in order to borrow. I think as I grew up, and then I started studying architecture, and I used to come home. The 720s was an interesting section for me because that was about architecture and technological books and technical books. If the library didn't have it, then we'd look and try and borrow it from one of the other libraries, and if they didn't have it, we'd try and borrow it from British Library. And if my librarian at the time was feeling generous, she'd actually order it in brand new for me. So no, some really good memories here. Oh, it's amazing the heights of these bookshelves. I think as a kid when I came in at the age of 9, they seemed so tall because these were the same size of bookshelves down in the junior library section. Obviously that bit's changed now. As I said, we used to have the 100s there, and then you'd come round and you'd be able to pick books up. And what was quite interesting, when I applied at the age of 16 to have a job here, I knew where every book pretty much was placed. And I always remember what the head librarian used to say when we started stricting, is that a book misplaced is a book lost. So I had to really work hard in stricting. Probably why I'm quite ordered with my books nowadays, actually. What's quite interesting is that I remember we bid as a practice to do work for the British Library, Boston Spa. We worked on the master plan. And we obviously got to the interview stage. And I remember the final question being asked by the team that was tasked with selecting the architect. They said, "Why do you want this job?" And everyone went silent for a moment. And I stood up and I said, "I have something to tell you. I used to work in the library." And my team looked around me and I'm thinking, "What are you doing here for me?" I said, "No, when I was 16, I used to spend so much time in my local library that when I turned 16, I got a job here." And I talked about the fact that I understood the Dewey Decimal System, how all the books were labelled, and that it would be an honour for HOK to work on the planning for Boston Spa. On the train on the way back, because obviously Boston Spa's up in Wetherby in York, my team said, "Did you really work in the library?" I said, "Yeah." I really, they wouldn't actually realise I was actually quite nerdy. I was sporty, but also nerdy. I think that's probably because my mother made us read and use the library to its fullest potential. I've actually tried to do that with my children now, to give them a love of reading and a love of books. And even though everything's online, you can Google, but there's nothing that actually replaces being able to open a book, read it, mull over it, mark it, come back to it. I just love it. I mean, my house is a bit of a mini library now because even though we still belong to our local library in Croydon, but I just enjoy buying books. And sometimes I buy them and just put them up there and I come back to them a couple of years later. But yeah. God, some fun memories. Yeah. I still believe now, I've been practicing architecture for nearly 30 years. It's one of those instrumental moments in my life being connected with Northcote Library. I have very fond memories of this building, and I still have a soft spot for it every time I walk past. My mother still lives just 2 roads away. I don't come in as often as I used to, but yeah, it's my library, yeah.